Lecture 11, Postmodern Times. The chaos and irrationality of the two world wars, the Cold Wars, and all the other wars of the 20th century led people to ask very fundamental questions. In particular, the same question that Pontius Pilate asked Christ: what is truth? Is truth a stable reality that persists throughout the changes of history, even terribly violent ones? Or is truth only something that is created by humans, according to the time they're in and experiences they face? Is chaos and not order and reason the most fundamental reality that exists? If so, does this mean that ultimately truth is but one's era's understanding of chaos and irrationality? Does our mind correspond to being, as Plato and Aristotle claimed? Or rather, as Immanuel Kant asserted, since it is impossible to know being, is it likewise impossible to bring our minds into correspondence with the reality of the world? Do we know the world only by conforming our experience of reality according to the categories of our mind? A 20th century movement called Postmodernism attempted to respond to these questions. Many of its proponents had a strong nihilistic tendency in their approach to reality, whereas the modern Enlightenment-influenced worldview was to simply accept that since the world is evidentially logical, rational, knowable, therefore we can understand the laws that the universe operates by. In contrast, many postmodernists argued that the world is not fundamentally logical, rational, knowable, and consequently, the only way we can know it is by creating truth that suits our historical context. In studying the phenomena of postmodernism, we will first examine how it was understood by certain influential thinkers. Then, we will see how this thought was translated into action. Finally, we will take a brief look at how certain architecture represent postmodern thought. For the purpose of this lecture, I will be focusing on a postmodern approach that Philip Carey labels as left-wing postmodernism, in contrast with right-wing postmodernism. According to so-called left-wing postmodernism, the modern project that began around the time of the Enlightenment views all of reality as logical and capable of being understood in a clear and distinct manner. In so exalting reason, modernists at the same time deem traditions and traditional thought as without merit and irrational. Left-wing postmodernists criticize modernists by pointing out that modern thought can't escape from a tradition, since every approach to reality necessarily includes terms that are defined within a tradition. Since tradition is irrational, argues postmodernists, in accordance with modernists, this means that ultimately any claim to reason is irrational, since it necessarily justifies its terms by appealing to authority within a tradition. Ultimately, this means that every tradition, including the tradition of modernity, is determined by the degree of power an individual has and not his ability to actually reason. In contrast with modernists and left-wing postmodernists, right-wing postmodernists, as explained by Carey, maintain that tradition is not irrational, but rather provides, and I quote, the context for rationality. Tradition is where you learn to reason. Tradition is where you learn to think. Tradition is where you learn to reason. Tradition is where you learn to think. Tradition is where you to learn the skills of thinking and reasoning, and indeed speaking with language. Think what happens when a 2-year-old begins to learn to speak. He learns language from his mother. We speak of a mother tongue, and he learns to be able to say things like no, wonderful. 2 years old love to say no, right? Language gives them the ability to be critical. Traditions breed critical thought. Traditions are the context for critical reasoning. Traditions don't have to be authoritarian and ignorant. Traditions can support reason. End of quote. Postmodern thought. The mental shift from viewing the world as understandable in itself to viewing the world as only understandable according to the structures of our mind, or according to a democratic consensus, or even according to the mind of a dictator that is later set as the standard for truth, had a profound impact on Western civilization. For this reason, in this section we will focus our attention to understanding the postmodern movement by beginning with the French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard, who will be followed by Sigmund Freud, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida. Jean-Francois Lyotard. The term postmodern was defined in 1979 by Jean-Francois Lyotard in his book The Postmodern Condition. According to Lyotard, postmodernism is anti-meta-narrative. Those who understand history from the perspective of meta-narrative believe that all of history is shaped by a single logical story. In the Christian meta-narrative, as stated by Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, the beginning of human history begins with Christ as the Alpha, first letter of the Greek alphabet, and will be fulfilled by Christ as the Omega, last letter of the Greek alphabet. The fulfillment of history will occur when Christ returns to judge the living and the dead and bring an end to time as we experience it currently. The Christian Christocentric meta-narrative, along with any other type of meta-narrative, even scientific ones, Lyotard rejects as having any validity. According to him, and I quote, "Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it. To the obsolescence of the meta-narrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds, most notably, the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution which in past relied on it. The narrative function is losing its functors, its great heroes, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal. It is being dispersed in clouds of narrative language elements, narrative, but also denotative, prescriptive, descriptive, and so on. Conveyed within each cloud are pragmatic valencies specific to its kind. Each of us lives at the intersection of many of these. However, we do not necessarily establish stable language communication combinations, and the properties of the ones we do establish are not necessarily communicable." End of quote. By denying that meta-narratives have an essential validity, Lyotard is essentially arguing that all we can do is tolerate the meaningless of life, since life has no real meaning behind it. Once life loses ultimate meaning, though, as the famous Viennese psychiatrist Viktor E. Frankl points out, then when the experiences of life become burdensome, it becomes exceedingly difficult to persevere in living. A why for life, argues Frankl in work on logos therapy, enables us to survive the how of life, and therefore is healing. Meta-narratives provide an ultimate why, i.e. reason for living. According to Christianity, because Christianity is based on the ultimate truth, the ultimate why for existence, who is Christ, it is the most fundamentally true meta-narrative. Michel Foucault and Sigmund Freud. Since the French postmodernist Michel Foucault relied heavily on the work of Sigmund Freud, we will take a glance at key Freudian concepts before discussing Foucault's postmodernism. Freud was an Austrian physician who developed psychoanalysis. According to Freud, what is essential to human beings is not reason, but rather the irrationality that lies behind reason. He named this chaotic jumble of conflicting desires the unconscious, in contrast with the rational conscious mind. The desires within the unconscious mind are not driven by any rational purpose. They simply are present, wanting fulfillment. One of the most powerful of these drives, argued Freud, is the desire for pleasure, in particular sexual pleasure. Freud thought that it is impossible for human beings to live together in an orderly manner if everyone's aim is only to satisfy their sexual drive for pleasure and to satisfy other drives, including the drives for power, life, and even death, understood as the state we all emerge out from and the state we're going towards and at times even want to revert back to. Since this is the case, argued Freud, this means as people began to live in cities, civilization developed by repressing the drive for life and pleasure and by repressing the drive for the total discharge of life in one intensely exciting moment. This means, according to Freud's logic, civilization, defined as people living together in close proximity in a relatively harmonious manner, is founded upon repression. Repression, though, will cause people to experience inner conflicts that for their health and for the health of civilization as a whole need to be resolved. According to Freud, resolution of inner conflict resulting from repressed desires can occur in psychotherapy sessions. In these sessions, the therapist encourages a patient to unravel his conflicting unconscious desire for life and death by talking freely, and without reservation, including on their dreams, which symbolize unconscious, unfulfilled desires. Along with psychotherapy, the negative consequences that repression causes can also be resolved by scientifically understanding the structures of the mind. The more we understand the mind in a scientific manner, argued the atheist Freud, then there will be less of a need to rely upon God to restrain people from acting out violently in order to satisfy their unconscious desires. In Freudian psychology, the mind is divided into three ways: the id, the ego, and the superego. These three regions overlap the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. The id is the region of the unconscious mind that is irrational, impulsive, and pleasure-driven. The superego is the region of the mind that is moralistic. Its moral standards are received externally from civilization. The ego acts as an arbitrator or referee between the id and the superego. Both with reference to and slight modification of Freud's hypothesis of repression, the French philosopher Michel Foucault argued that what civilization perceives to be morally bad and morally good is determined by how the civilization chooses to suppress sexual desires by outlawing, or at least perceiving as sinful, certain sexual behavior. Foucault believed that civilization had reached a point where freedom of the individual need not be confined by moral sexual rules imposed upon the individual by society. Tragically, Foucault died of AIDS in 1984. In profound disagreement with both Freud and Foucault, Saint John Paul II, in Veritatis Splendor, affirms that freedom is not simply defined by the fulfillment of desire, but also, and more importantly, by the freedom to act in accordance with our nature given to us by God. Since God created us, and since we have the ability to reason in a way animals cannot, our understanding as Christians of what is sexually morally right and morally wrong is not determined by a particular historical context, but rather determined by our God-given nature. As explained by the noted moral theologian Father Brian Mullady, Freudian thought that Foucault based his reasoning on understands the moral law in a conscient manner as an external imposition on human freedom. In contrast, Catholics view the moral law as an interior judgment concerning our nature as human beings, specifically on what the various aspects of human nature are oriented to. According to Catholicism, emotions are created by God to naturally follow reason. Therefore, out of reason and not out of fear, and I quote from a lady, I deny my emotions some good that they are seeking because it is leading me to something unreasonable. In other words, something that is contrary to my nature. End of quote. This decision causes me emotional integrity. It does not destroy my emotional integrity. Aristotle also follows this understanding when he describes the intemperate man, the continent man, and the temperate man. Jacques Derrida. Like Foucault, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida also identified himself with postmodernism's rejection of stable, persistent truth that lasts through history, and which man has a capacity to bring his mind and actions into correspondence with. Unlike Foucault, though, Derrida understood the postmodern claim that all things are fundamentally relative by not focusing on sexuality, but rather on language. According to Derrida's understanding of language, it is impossible to know an author's intention because the author lacks an intention even if he claims otherwise. This is because the writings the author produces are shaped by formless desires that are often in conflict with one another. All use of language, argues Derrida, whether written, spoken, or thought of, is ambiguous and indeterminate with no underlying message. In order to reveal the meaningless behind any use of language, Derrida developed a way of critiquing language called deconstruction. When a person is deconstructing a text in a postmodern manner, the purpose is to reveal that what underlies the text is vague, formless, and contradictory. A Christian response to Derrida is that all language has meaning because all language is a participation in the one Word of God, who is Christ, the eternally begotten Word that the Father speaks in the love of the Holy Spirit. This means that if a person were to truly deconstruct the use of any language, then ultimately he will end up with the word that underlies the use of all words. This one word is Christ, who gives ultimate meaning and is the standard by which to judge the truthfulness of words written, spoken, or thought of in any language. Postmodern action. The postmodern concepts of the above referred to men and of similar thinkers were a factor in bringing about various radical expressions of life, as particularly evident by students of the 1960s. The student protests throughout the Western world during the tumultuous 60s coincided with what has been called the sexual revolution. We'll examine both of these expressions of postmodern thought. Student revolts and the 1960s. The postmodernist destructive deconstruction of truth claims was understood by many students of the late 1960s and the 1970s as promising liberation. Liberation in this context is understood as liberation from past constraints that once were thought to be in accordance with reality, but now, according to the postmodernists, only impositions of society in order to maintain order and, to a certain extent, the status quo. Why not, question students, forge another path by redefining what is right and wrong, especially when it comes to sexual ethics? In their questioning of authority, students in the late 1960s and in the 1970s began holding protests across Europe and in the United States. A number of the first student protests occurred in West Germany, and interestingly involved students studying theology. The reason, as explained by Joseph Ratzinger, was that theology was taught in a highly professional manner that entailed much debate over historical and structural facts, to the detriment of truths of faith such as Christ truly rose from the dead, the immortality of the soul, and the capacity of man to grow spiritually. These theology students quickly became bored with the painstaking professionalism of their theology teachers and wanted to understand theology as a practical science that would better the world. Unfortunately, many of these students did not look to the saints for inspiration, but rather to Karl Marx. In explaining the student mind from this tumultuous times, Ratzinger writes, I quote, "Many students believed only Marxism could help an ailing theology back on its feet and restore to it the consciousness of being a real science. On the other hand, only the influx of religious passion and hope could once more lend Marxism, which was already scientifically and politically exhausted, the luster of a bright prospect for humanity outside of its sphere of hegemony." End of quote. The wedding of Marxism to theology eventually was expressed in a variety of political theologies. By wedding itself to Marxism, however, argues Ratzinger, theology then resembled a blind man being led by a blind man into a ditch. In describing theology students influenced by Marxist thought, Ratzinger refers to a flyer issued in the summer of 1969 by Protestant theology students of the University of Tübingen. The flyer asserted that the New Testament is a document of inhumanity, a large-scale deception of the masses. The flyer went on, describes Ratzinger, to accuse, and I quote, the Church of sharing in the guilt of capitalist exploitation of the poor, and it ascribed to traditional theology the function of propping up the system. The sexual revolution. Students were not the only ones who questioned authority and traditional ways of perceiving morality, education, governments, military, and other like reality. A common subject which people of all age groups questioned in a particularly intense manner during the 1960s and 1970s was traditional sexual morality. The French female postmodern existential writer Simone de Beauvoir and longtime friend of the French existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre concisely represented this questioning in her 1949 book, The Second Sex. According to Simone de Beauvoir, a person is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman. This is because, she claimed, sex is what one is born with, but gender, a term what Beauvoir did not use, but that clarifies her ideas, defined what is male, what is female, and what is between male and female is culturally defined. As she explains, I quote, "No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine." End of quote. Along with the influence of postmodern existential thought, there were other factors that helped to cause this questioning. A main one was the advancement of technology. As technology developed, more and more countries began transitioning from agriculturally based economies to factory and office based economies. In agriculturally based economies, children had significant economic value since they can be put to work on the farm at little cost. However, in a factory and office based economy that restricts child labor, children have much less economic value since they cannot be as easily put to work by their parents as they were in the past. This means that as a country develops its economy by relying more on technology, there's less of a financial incentive in the sense of profit for men and women to raise a number of children and even to restrain their sexual desires in order to keep their family unit intact. One negative side effect of couples having only one or a few or even no children at all is that there will be few, if any, family members to care for the couple when they're elderly. It is not surprising, therefore, that during the 1960s, birth control devices began to be used with ever greater frequencies, and universities instituted co-ed interaction, including in dormitories. As the bonding aspect of sexual intercourse became separated more and more from the generative aspect, in other words, being open to babies, the next logical step occurred. If men and women can separate the sexual union from the end of giving birth to babies, some argued, then there's nothing wrong with men having sex with men and women having sex with women. In all three cases, what is being sought is sexual union with another human being, while not being open to new life. During the 1970s, consequently, the gay liberation movement developed and began to demand legal protection. The logic of separating sexual union from procreation was also evident in the rise of pornography. In 1953, the U.S. publisher Hugh Hefner, with his journal Playboy, effectively marketed pornography to the average man. Currently, the selling of pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Postmodern architecture. How we choose to construct the buildings we live is an indicator of our worldviews, our philosophies, and our theological beliefs. For example, the soaring, majestic medieval and Renaissance cathedrals physically represent the then common belief in God and transcendent realities such as angels, heaven, purgatory, and hell. Our current postmodern age also has its own unique architecture that represents the inner conviction of many that ultimately there is no stable truth and no philosophical and religious principles that stay true as time changes. And in the transcript, I provide examples of postmodern architecture. God bless.